So let me share my screen here, and we're going to say the blessing for study together. And then we're going to launch into a study of some Hasidic stories for the High Holy Days. So if you'd like to unmute, you can do so now, and we'll say this blessing together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, anu sok divrei Torah. Blessed is the one whose mitzvot, whose commandments are holy, and who commands us to immerse or to engage ourselves in words of Torah. So our topic for today, Hasidic stories for the High Holy Days. And I want to start with a little word association. We're going to use the chat function for this. So just whatever word or words comes to mind when I say days of awe, what does it bring to your mind? Put it into the chat. World Series, thank you, Dad. Stress dreams. I understand, Leah, my sermons aren't done either. So I see words like new beginning, solemn, synagogue, high holidays, personal reflection, forgiveness, days of yuck. You know that for some people, this is a hard time of year. Focused reflection. High holidays are a really different time of year than the rest of the year, right? The rest of the year often feels Jewishly like gratitude and rejoicing. And the high holidays, there's some of that, but then there's also a lot of tshuva, repentance, focused reflection, renewal, repair. The high holidays, I was saying to someone earlier today, actually to Beck, who's here on the call, that I think the high holidays are the least fun part of the Jewish year. It doesn't mean that they're the least important or the least meaningful, but they aren't as fun because of what we engage in during the high holy days is much more self-reflective and often difficult than what we do during the rest of the year. And I see that reflected in the words that a lot of you just put into the chat. One more word association. What words or ideas come to your mind when I say the word Chassidut or Hasidic Judaism? So I see some words coming in. I see joy. I see payas. Yeah, fair enough. And black hats, right? The clothing often worn by Haredi, by ultra-Orthodox Jews. Joy and worship, dancing, tree huggers, historic attire. I see joyful. The word joyful, singing, dancing keeps coming up over and over and over again here, which is interesting because we just said that the High Holy Days are largely not a time of joy, although there is some joy, that they are a time of solemn reflection. And we're now going to look at the High Holidays through the lens of some of the Hasidic masters. So the stories that we're about to look at, which are all short tales, come from this book. I know it's a little hard to see in your screen there, but this is a book that's called Tales of the Hasidim, Early Masters, compiled by Martin Buber. You might know the name of Martin Buber from his famous teachings about I and thou, the idea of finding God through relationship with others, other people, other beings, other elements of the world. Buber also was a scholar of and a lover of Hasidic Judaism, although he himself was not a Hasid. That is to say, unlike someone like, for example, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Buber didn't grow up Hasidic. Buber sort of fell in love with Hasidic Judaism as an outsider to it, largely by accompanying his father, Rabbi Solomon Buber, who was a scholar in his own right, to visit and be in Hasidic communities. So Buber then took it upon himself later in his life to compile stories that he heard the Hasidim telling, which are oftentimes stories about their rebbes. One of the features of Hasidic Judaism is that it is built around the personality of the Rebbe. When we say the Rebbe, these days we all think of Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who was the last Rebbe of the Lubavitcher Hasidim. But the Rebbe is a particular Hasidic institution of a rabbi who's more so. The Rebbe is a community leader, a spiritual leader, often a mystical leader who's seen to have often special mystical powers and to embody the values of the Hasidic community. And the first Rebbe, although I don't know if the word was actually used for him, but the first Rebbe is the Ba'al Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidic Judaism. So the stories we're going to look at today over the next 45 minutes or so are going to be stories that the Hasidim tell about their Rebbes. And from this, I think we can extract some of what they have to say about the High Holy Days and about what the High Holy Days, the days of awe, might mean for us. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I'll be totally honest with you. I have no particular agenda here other than to do what I sometimes call good old-fashioned Torah study or good old-fashioned text study, which is to say, I want to study these stories together and see what we find in them. What do they say to us about the high holidays? I also have to apologize that you can see this is a little messy. I didn't have the time to recopy all of these stories, so I actually just photocopied my copy of Buber's Tales of the Hasidim, and that's what you see before you. So it's a little hard to read, but I think it's readable enough. We're going to start here. Oh, and I do intend this as a discussion. So, if you see something interesting, you see something you want to comment on, please just raise your hand electronically or put it into the chat. And I would love to hear what all of us have to say, how these stories sit with us as we go through these stories that the Rebbes, the Hasidim are telling about their Rebbes. We're going to start actually with a couple of short tales that have nothing to do with the high holidays, but you're going to see why I'm doing this in order to essentially introduce the figure of the Ba'al Shem Tov. The Ba'al Shem Tov is the founder of Hasidic Judaism. Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, sometimes called Rabbi Israel Ba'al Shem Tov. Ba'al Shem Tov means a master of a good name. It was also a word for a sort of mystical magic maker in those days. But the Ba'al Shem Tov is not just a magician. He's not just a Ba'al Shem. He is a Ba'al Shem Tov. He is a mystic who brings the goodness of God into the world. That's why he's called that. And yes, Leah, I see your comment, and I will call out the page numbers. This is on page 35 of this older edition. Hopefully, you have the same edition as me. And I want to look at a couple of stories where the Rebbes, the Hasidim, just talk about what kind of person was the Ba'al Shem Tov, and then we'll talk about what that has to do with the High Holy Days. Some of these get a little weird, including this first one. So here we go. This is called the Tree of Knowledge. They say that once, when all souls were gathered in Adam's soul, at the hour he stood beside the tree of knowledge, the soul of the Ba'al Shem Tov went away and did not eat of the fruit of the tree. Let me just ask you before we go to the next story, what is happening here? What is this story, this sentence? What does it say about the Ba'al Shem Tov? Bob says it's too ridiculous. All right, Bob, fair enough. Rachel says the Ba'al Shem Tov didn't sin. Robert says he's a kind of a superhero. Robert, do you want to tell us more about that? What do you mean by kind of a superhero?
Well, he's got supernatural powers. Later, we're going to see him act like Green Lantern and Superman, like Clark Kent. He hides his identity and then he reveals it. He has the mantle passed on to him by Adam, another dying Hasid, kind of like Green Lantern receives his power from Abin Sur in the 1956 version. So he's more than human.
So before there were superheroes, there were Rebbes, right? And before there were superheroes,
Absolutely.
there were stories of rabbis in the Talmud. People have been telling those kind of stories for a long time, and we do have that here. There's something sort of supernatural here about this story. I see Bob, and then I see Anne.
I think this is a desperate attempt to try to reconstruct every kind of element of the world, whether it's the modern world or the slightly before that period when Ba'al Shem Tov lived, etc. How is it that all of the souls are wrapped up in the soul of Adam, first of all? And second of all, you mean we've all depleted his soul now by coming into existence? And second of all, how did the Ba'al Shem Tov's soul have any option as to what to do? And on top of that, how come the soul would need or not need to eat? Ridiculous.
Fair enough. All right. So ridiculous in all those ways. Anne, go ahead.
Well, there's a lot of mysticism in Kabbalah. And I think what it's saying is that of all the souls that gathered by the tree of knowledge, the most obedient, the most pious was the Baal Shem. He did not eat of that tree, and he has eternal life now.
Yep. So we've made the Ba'al Shem into a superhero here, right? He didn't sin when Adam sinned. He didn't do wrong when Adam did wrong. All the rest of us may have, but not the Ba'al Shem Tov. However, there's another feature to this story, because which tree is he eating from or not eating from in the case, as the case may be? The tree of knowledge, right? Now, clearly that's the tree that appears in the story, right? That's the tree by which Adam and Eve are, kicked out of the garden and the whole deal. But also, it's the tree of knowledge, which means that this is the way that humanity gained a certain lack of innocence. This is the way that humanity moves from innocence into whatever is the opposite of innocence, from naivete into knowing. The trade-off of the Adam and Eve story is that you're going to be kicked out of the garden, but also you're going to have a great deal of knowledge now. And I see your comment. It's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's not just good and evil. It's knowledge of good and evil. So the Ba'al Shem Tov didn't eat from the tree of knowledge. And I think here that there's a double entendre being made. One of the messages here is, yeah, our Rebbe is perfect. He didn't eat from the tree. He didn't sin. But the other is, our Rebbe didn't necessarily start with the knowledge that you might think a rabbi would have. Our Rebbe isn't actually perfect. He doesn't have a perfect origin story. And to bolster my point, I want to show you another story about, this is so hard to move, about the Ba'al Shem Tov being something other than the knowledgeable good kid. This is it's a little hard to see, but this is number 2 on the right side of the page. It says as follows: after the death of Israel's father, the people looked out for the boy for the sake of Rabbi Eliezer, that's his father, whose memory was dear to him. They sent his son to a Melamed. What's a Melamed? Melamed is a teacher, right? In those days, you'd send a boy to a Melamed to teach him Torah. That was how you learned your basics. This is essentially a way of saying they sent him to Hebrew school. He went to Sunday school every week. Raise your hand if you were a perfect angel in Hebrew school every week when you were a kid, right? All right, Dad, you can put your hand down. The one in the room, right? Okay. You would have thought that the Hasidim would have said that the Ba'al Shem Tov was a perfect angel in Hebrew school, right? You would have thought that the story about the founder of this movement, based in joy of Judaism, would have been someone who was totally engaged and knowledgeable about Judaism. But that's not what it says. It says, now Israel studied diligently enough, but always only for a few days running. Then he played truant, and they found him somewhere in the woods and alone. They ascribed this behavior to the fact that he was an orphan without proper care and supervision, and returned him to the Melamed over and over. And over the boy escaped to the woods until the people despaired of ever making an honest and upright man of him. So my question is, why would the Hasidim write a story about their founder as being someone who skipped Hebrew school all the time, someone who wasn't engaged in Jewish learning and Jewish knowledge? Why? This is a whole other version of the reason that the Ba'al Shem Tov doesn't eat from the tree of knowledge. He actually doesn't have the knowledge and the discipline, at least as it seems, to be a rabbi. He doesn't have what you would expect of a rabbi or of a leader or of a knowledgeable leader of the Jewish people. So I see a couple hands. I see Susan, Amy, and then Rabbi Leah.
Okay, well, first of all, I think this is totally delightful. And while I am a troublemaker now, when I was in Hebrew school, I didn't dare make any trouble because I never made trouble lest something horrible befall me. But I think this is just delightful. And what the first one said, if you could put the text up for a second, the first one says, like I said, this is a midrash. I mean, we never learned that all of the souls of all of the humanity of the universe were gathered in Adam's soul. This is new information. And the Ba'al Shem Tov probably knew, maybe, this is the other side of the coin, what would happen if he were to eat of it. And since he was, as we see in the second story, frequently truant, he ran away. So what is being set up here is a level of mischievousness that might lead us into the joyousness of Hasidic masters, if that made sense. So he's not the smartest coin in the book, coin in the wallet, not the smartest page in the book. He's mischievous, but periodically he'll study and then he won't. So who does this describe? Every child in the universe.
Yep. Thank you, Susan. And I'll just say that it may not mean he's not the smartest, but it means he's not focused necessarily on the study, the intricacy of study, right? Which you can see where this leads to the joy. He'll be focused instead on the joy. Somebody put in the chat, every person has the potential to be a superhero. So the Ba'al Shem Tov is now set up as the every person who skips out on the original opportunity to gain the knowledge of the world, and ultimately is has to do so by making his way joyfully through the world. Amy, go ahead, and then Rabbi Leah, and then Anne.
That gives me some decent evidence that he's clued into something. He needs balance. Sure, he can sit down and be a good student, but if he's going to do it two-way street, he needs time in nature to let everything go. Be beyond everything.
Yep. And who's to say that we can't find God in nature, by the way, right? I mean,
You're absolutely right. Of course we can. We have many blessings linked to nature.
Exactly. So going out and being alone in the woods, who's to say that's not an act of Jewish connection? Skipping Hebrew school, let it be said you heard it here. Skipping Hebrew school can be an act of Jewish connection, even though I never said that to my own children. Rabbi Leah Berkowitz, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking that it's kind of anti-establishment because he's basically like his movement is going to be rebelling against the people that sit all day in the yeshiva and study. So they're showing that from a very young age, he was either that you could either see that he was rebelling against it or that he wasn't finding what he needed in it, or both.
Right. Yeah, so he then comes to represent those who don't find what they need in the establishment version of Judaism. And by the way, Hasidic Judaism, as you point out, was a rebellion. It was a rebellion against an establishment form of Judaism that was very much about yeshiva and study. The Ba'al Shem Tov, and I often joke that the Ba'al Shem Tov comes along and says, you don't need to do all that study. Just sing Ay Digi Dai 1,000 times and you can find God that way. And it's facetious, but it's not entirely facetious, because he does believe that all of us are capable of finding God, sometimes in the classroom, but sometimes amongst the trees outside the classroom. Anne, go ahead.
I think it's saying that he lacked the knowledge and he lacked a good teacher and the guidance. And the legend goes that he found that teacher and the guidance in Elijah. and Elijah became his teacher and guided him. And that's just many tales. There are a zillion of them.
Right. So that's exactly, what we're talking about here. And Robert, I see your comment. We have to differentiate between the Hasidut of the Ba'al Shem Tov and the Hasidut of today, which is essentially a form of Haredi Judaism, right? The Hasidic movements have all essentially aligned themselves with ultra-Orthodoxy. And the Jewish world is realigned today. There used to be Hasidim and Misnagdim, right? And Hasidim were a rebellion against the Misnagdim, which was the much more yeshivish form of Judaism. These days, the Jewish world has, this is a simplification, but essentially realigned into Orthodoxy and liberal, meaning that the Hasidic movements have aligned themselves on the Orthodox side. But there's a great deal of Hasidut happening in the liberal Jewish world as well, not least in, for example, the Jewish renewal movement of Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who was a disciple of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and Martin Buber and Abraham Joshua Heschel. These are people who brought out Hasidic values in the liberal world as well, but without being part of the official Hasidic movements. So that's an important distinction, because what we're looking at here is not what we might call yeshivish Haredi Judaism at all, right? What we're looking at here is a rebellion against that, even though those words didn't yet exist. Which brings me to a story on page 39, which some of you might have heard before. This is a rabbinic favorite, but I want to bring it here because I think it relates to exactly what we're talking about. This is a story called The Little Whistle. And it goes like this. A villager who year after year prayed in the Ba'al Shem Tov's house of prayer in the days of awe, had a son who was so dull-witted that he could not even grasp the shapes of the letters, let alone the meaning of the holy words. Now I'm going to pause for a moment and ask, and just name that some of the language here is not the nicest, right? If we were rewriting this story, we would not use language like dull-witted. We also have to ask, is this a young child? Is this a child with cognitive impairment? Is this a child who has not had opportunity to study? Why is it, for some reason, this child does not understand know how to read Hebrew or know the meanings of the prayers, right? That's who we're talking about here. A child who doesn't know the meanings of the prayers and isn't able to participate in the service for some reason. I'm here on this fourth line. On the days of awe, his father did not take him to town with him because he did not understand anything. But when he was 13 and of age, according to the laws of God, his father took him along on the Day of Atonement, for fear the boy might eat on the fast day simply because he did not know any better. Now the boy had a small whistle which he always blew when he sat out in the fields to herd the sheep and the calves. He had taken this with him in the pocket of his smock, and his father had not noticed it. We're up here now. Hour after hour, the boy sat in the house of prayer and had nothing to say. But when the additional service commenced, the additional service is the Musaf. It's the service that comes after Shacharit, after the morning service. So this is when Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur morning is getting really long, right? You've been in services 3 hours already, and they start a whole new Amidah. When the additional service commenced, he said, "Father, I have my little whistle with me. I want to sing on it," or play on it, presumably. The father was greatly perturbed and told him to do no such thing, and the boy restrained himself. But when the afternoon service was begun, he said again, "Father, do let me blow my little whistle." The father became angry and said, "Where did you put it?" And when the boy told him, he laid his hand in his pocket so the boy could not take it out. And now the closing prayer began. The Ne'ilah service had begun. The boy snatched his pocket away from his father's hand, took out the whistle and blew a loud note. All were frightened and confused, but the Ba'al Shem Tov went on with the prayer, only more quickly and more easily than usual. Later he said, "The boy made things easy for me." How many have heard this story before, or a version of this story? Anybody? I see a bunch of hands up. All right, I started with something you've heard before. Tell me, what do you see in this story? What are we supposed to learn? And specifically, what are we supposed to learn about the high holidays from this story? Susan.
Well, this story is very, very familiar to me. And it always struck me that the boy was like the son in the Four Questions who didn't know how to ask a proper question for whatever reason. And when he blew the whistle, it was almost like a shofar blast. And everybody was so tired at the end, especially the Ba'al Shem Tov, who had been leading prayer all day and fasting. When he heard that sound, he sort of woke up and he was able to carry on quickly and easily and not fall asleep. But the boy had awakened within him the urge and the desire and the requisite energy and kavanah to continue. And for that, it was a blessing.
Yep. So maybe he literally woke him up, right? The Rambam says, Maimonides says that the shofar wakes us up. It calls us, Uru yishenim mishenatchem. Wake up from your sleep, you slumberers. So there's this idea that we sort of walk through our lives asleep, and the shofar is supposed to wake us up spiritually, I suppose, from that. And several of you in the comments as well said that the flute here is like or the whistle is like a shofar, right? It wakes the people up. Only the whistle is not permitted on Yom Kippur, right? He's literally breaking halakha. He is literally breaking the law, breaking Jewish law by blowing on this whistle. And he's of age, he's over 13, so he was responsible for his own actions. But the Ba'al Shem Tov doesn't seem perturbed by this. He doesn't seem worried about this kid breaking halakha. He seems actually more energized by the sound of the whistle, by something about this boy playing this whistle. Bob, go ahead.
I think the kavanah is the important part of this. And another element that I've heard of this story is that the Ba'al Shem Tov knew that there was something wrong with their prayer that day, and the gates of prayer were not fully open. And he was worried that they're coming toward the end of Yom Kippur, and no one's going to get, you know, what they need from it because their prayers are not being heard. And this suddenly cleared the way, like a whistle on the train track or whatever, for everybody's prayers to get in.
Yeah, the purity of the kavanah, right? Somebody said in the chat as well, the intent means more than the letter of the law, that it's not about doing it, quote unquote, right. It's about doing it with intention. I'll put the word kavanah in the chat. Kavanah, oh, not Savannah, sorry. Kavanah, which means intention, or sometimes we use it to talk about spiritual intention, right? That this boy, he doesn't know the words, he doesn't know how to participate, and not unlike the Ba'al Shem Tov, who didn't eat from the tree of knowledge, he doesn't have the knowledge, but this boy is able to lift up the prayers, to make it easier for the Rebbe, for God's sake, by having this pure intention, the desire to be there, and the desire to interface with the divine. Amy, please.
Well, definitely easy to parrot off pretty much everything already spoken. Don't want to be boring and or repetitive. They don't have it hard making reference to his intent and the effect he had after so many hours of praying, and some, you're saying certain prayers more than once. Holy earth, as she's gonna start echoing years, you're not gonna have sense of time. Has it been an hour or a minute? And then something like that happens, like, I'm here. I'm doing something specific. They've helped you reestablish any kind of energy or rhythm you had.
Thank you.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
let's turn to another story that's similar. I just want to read what it says in the chat. I wonder if this one could be interpreted as justifying the inclusion for folks with disabilities or neurodivergent who might need to communicate in different ways. In this context, their prayers can be seen as welcome or even refreshing rather than as a distraction. I love that, Adam. Thank you. I think that it's a clear extension to me of the idea that there doesn't have to be one right way. The Ba'al Shem Tov seems focused not on getting it the right way, but rather on people bringing their whole selves to the experience. And and their whole authentic selves. And that by definition would include people who have disabilities, or people who have different levels of knowledge, people who may or may not have had access to the education that's required to be in high holiday services. Think about it. Even just to walk into high holiday services and pick up a prayer book and know what you're doing requires some knowledge. In liberal congregations, we try to make it more accessible. We have transliteration, we call pages, things like that. But still, how easy is it to get lost? How easy is it to be this boy, regardless of your ability, of your type of ability? How easy is it to be this boy for all of us? And so I think the Ba'al Shem Tov is encouraging us here to come as our whole selves, rather than thinking we're getting it wrong on the holidays. Who you are is good, and what you bring to the high holiday experience is good. This next story I think will be similar but a little different. It's on the left side of page 68, and it's called The Axe. Once, the Ba'al Shem had his disciple, Rabbi Wolf Kitzes, learn the kavanot of blowing the ram's horn, so that on New Year's Day, he might announce before him the order of the sounds. The kavanot, what that means is that in some mystical practices, before you say tekiah, there's a kavanah, there's a short passage that is meant to direct your intention and make you, spiritually focus on a certain thing, so that you can bring the proper intention to the act of calling the shofar blasts. So Rabbi Wolf Kitzes is supposed to learn the kavanot and then call the shofar blasts. I'm on the fourth line here. Rabbi Wolf learned the kavanot, but for greater security, tell me if you've ever done this before, noted everything down on a slip of paper which he hid in his bosom. He tucked it in his shirt, right? His cheat sheet for what he was supposed to say before calling each of the blasts. The paper, however, dropped out soon after, and he never noticed it. It's like a TV show almost. Now, when it was time to blow, Rabbi Wolf looked for his slip in vain. Then he tried to remember the kavanot, but he had forgotten everything. Tears rose to his eyes, and weeping, he announced the order of sounds quite simply, without referring to the kavanot at all. Later, the Ba'al Shem said to him, "There are many halls in the king's palace, and intricate keys open the doors. But the axe is stronger than all these, and no bolt can withstand it. What are all kavanot compared to one really heartfelt grief?" So again, I'll ask you, what do you see here? It's similar, but it's different, right? You have here again someone who doesn't exactly know the right way, but there's a focus here on the emotional response that he has to it, the grief, the feelings that pour out of him when he wishes to call the shofar blessing, or call the shofar calls. Amy, what's your take?
He feels super guilty because he had tried as hard as possible. He had no idea when his paper went and left him. Like, peers, I have been backed into a corner. I'm gonna do it as best I can. And his leader grasped, all right, smooth. So you're human. You went and wound up making a mistake, but I'm not gonna freak. A, I'm where you're human, and B, I can see and hear how guilty you feel since you're crying.
Yeah, what an amazing high holiday message. You are human, and that's okay. And in fact, not even just okay, but greater than all. What does he say? The axe is stronger than every door. How do you open the doors? With authentic emotion, with coming as your whole self. He opens the gates of heaven. So that's not unlike what somebody said earlier, that in the other version of the whistle story, I think it was Bob, in the other version of the whistle story, the Ba'al Shem Tov says the gates weren't really open, and this opened the gates of heaven. Here again, we have this notion that the outpouring of authentic emotion, the really caring and wanting to be there, that's what opens the gates of heaven, not getting the words right. Susan, go ahead.
I'm just a little confused because he had learned what he needed to learn to announce the requisite shofar blows. But in order to make sure that he had it correct, he had his piece of paper with him, just like those of us who chant Torah frantically review our text beforehand, our Xerox from the Tikkun. But some of us anyway. And then he tried to remember, but he'd forgotten. But then it sounds, if I read this correctly, it sounds like he actually did it correctly.
So there's two things here. There's the kavanot, and then there's the order, the actual calls. So what he can't remember is the kavanah, the fancier spiritual passage that comes before tekiah. What he does is say tekiah, because he can't remember the other words, right? So you're right, he doesn't not do it. He actually does it halakhically correctly here, right? All you need to say is tekiah. But what he's not able to do is to say the passage that was supposed to direct his mind properly in the right direction. And what the Ba'al Shem Tov is saying essentially is that your tears did that. Your emotions were I guess the proof that you were directed it, that you had that kavanah, that was the real authentic kavanah versus needing to say somebody else's words. So it's an interesting thought about how much of our prayer experience is saying words that somebody else wrote versus the individual, the personal prayer experience. How much do we need for our high holy days to be about the work that we do? And how much do we want for our high holy days to be about standing beside others and saying certain words that connect us with other people? Anne, go ahead.
Well, supposedly there are different halls that interconnect and you climb through them. And they're modeled after the temple in Jerusalem. And his grief was like the key and the adze that opened all the doors to reach the Holy of Holies. And that's how you connect to prayer, by climbing through these doors.
Yeah, right, by bringing your kavanah. And I just want to point out what Rabbi Paula said in the chat, that the kavanah have become the keva, right? So a beautiful, intentional, spiritual poem that starts off as somebody's kavanah becomes keva. Keva meaning that which is fixed. And there's nothing wrong, by the way, with keva. We need fixed prayer to be Jews. We need to be saying prayers that we're sharing with all others. But the keva, the fixed prayers, don't always include our intentionality. So here he forgoes the traditional words of the prayer, which started off as somebody's kavanah, but then became some words he was supposed to just recite. He forgoes those to bring his own new kavanah, kind of like how, every 25 years or so, the Reform movement creates a new prayer book, because we need to bring new ideas. We need to bring new, unlike the Orthodox prayer book, which has, largely remained the same for a while. We believe in continually bringing new ideas and kavanot and spirituality to the prayer book, which, by the way, is a really old idea, because if you look in the traditional prayer book, you find medieval poems, you find things that were written by the rabbis in all times. Our prayer book has always been a sort of an anthology of our kavanah from throughout different ages. Let's shift to something else here. I'm going to go to page 70 for those who have the book. And we're going to read this one that's called The Court Sweeper. Once, just before New Year's, the Ba'al Shem came to a certain town and asked the people who read the prayers there on the days of awe. They replied this was done by the Rav of the town. And what is his manner of praying? Asked the Ba'al Shem. On the Day of Atonement, they said, he recites all the confessions of sin in the most cheerful tones. I'll just stop for a second. This is surprising, right? rabbis in the room, and there are 3 or 4 of us, how do you recite the prayers of the Yom Kippur service? It's mostly not in cheerful tones. Can you imagine? Who shall live and who shall die? Who by fire and who by water? No, it's a time of solemnity, right? It's a time of awe. But the Ba'al Shem Tov comes to this town and he finds out that the local rabbi recites the Yom Kippur prayers in the most cheerful of tones. Why does he do that? Well, let's continue. The Ba'al Shem Tov sent for the Rav and asked him the cause of this strange behavior. The Rav answered, "The least among the servants of the king, he whose task it is to sweep the forecourt free of dirt, sings a merry song as he works, for he does what he is doing to gladden the king." Said the Ba'al Shem, "May my lot be with yours." All right, once again, I'll ask you what you see here. Anybody want to parse this story? Tell us what it is we're reading and what it means. Bob, please.
This is sort of like Hillel and Shammai. I mean, Hillel, who's usually right, when Shammai is right, he admits it.
Oh, so okay, so the Ba'al Shem comes in, he learns something new. That's what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. He's surprised by this, right? He comes in and he learns something new from somebody. So the great leader of Hasidic Judaism, not afraid to learn from others. That's a really good high holiday lesson there. And what is it he learns? Rabbi Paula, are you raising your hand there? I can't tell.
Sort of. I'm just on my phone, so it's a little hard to do this because my computer is whatever. What I get from this is that this is reminding us that the lowly things that we do, like confessing sins, putting, sweeping the dirt out from inside of us, is pleasant to God. It gladdens God when we clear ourselves. It's like God wants us to be able to recognize our sins and repent. Just like the sweeper who's sweeping the dirt away. It's not a wonderful task. I don't like cleaning toilets, but it has to be done. Something has to be done to keep everything running smoothly. So that's what I see in this, that it elevates the lowly. What we think may be not such a great thing to be doing is actually the right thing to be doing.
Right. When we started this with our word association, we associated the High Holy Days with words like awe, words like solemnity, things like that, right? This is a hard time of year. But this a little bit turns that on its head by way of saying this is actually a joyous task. As you say, Paula, I don't like cleaning toilets either. But you know what? Afterwards, I look at that toilet and I'm really happy that it's clean now, right? So that's maybe a little bit what's going on here, that there is a joyous task to be performed on the High Holy Days, and it's the task of sweeping ourselves clean. We think of that as a hard task. We enter into the High Holidays, I think, with a fair amount of trepidation, with a fair amount of solemnity and awe. And maybe the Ba'al Shem here wants us to think about it a little differently, to think about it as a joyous task, because it is actually the task of helping ourselves become best selves. And that's hard while we're in the midst of it, but it's actually joyous when we look back on it. Aren't we glad that we have Yom Kippur? Aren't we glad that we have this opportunity to think about being our best, to make plans for the coming year, to think about how we could do better? That's hard work, but how lucky, how joyful can we be that we have this opportunity to think about being our best selves? Anne, please.
If we stop and we pause and we observe, we can learn from everything and everyone, and recognizing the gifts of all God's creatures is the point of the story.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, that's a really good segue into the next story, which is on the next side of the page. Over here, it's the one that's called To One Who Admonished. And I apologize that this is a little bit small, but see if I can make it bigger. I'm on page 71 toward the bottom. To one who admonished. The Ba'al Shem Tov said this to a tzaddik who used to preach admonishing sermons. So imagine now your rabbi gets up and admonishes you during the high holidays, tells you all the things you need to change, tells you all the things you did wrong. This is the kind of rabbi we're talking about here, the admonisher. What does the Ba'al Shem Tov say to him? What do you know about admonishing? You yourself have remained unacquainted with sins all the days of your life, and you've had nothing to do with the people around you. How should you know what sinning is? Thoughts, comments? So again, he kind of turns the high holidays on its head, right? You would have thought that the high holidays were about being perfect as you can be. And here stands a perfect person in front of the congregation admonishing them. And what does the Ba'al Shem Tov say to him? You don't really understand people. Who are you to admonish them? You who never really did anything wrong, who never really lived life. I suppose, says the Ba'al Shem Tov who used to run away from Hebrew school, right? So again, we have the Ba'al Shem Tov as this every person who is human, who brings his whole self to the experience of life. And therefore, what he most appreciates is not the perfect tzaddik who will tell you all the things you did wrong, but rather the people who actually do wrong and who are striving to be their best. So I see Rabbi Paula, and then I see Amy, and then Beck.
So I'm thinking of the comment that the rabbis make that the perfect tzaddik, the one that they're talking about here, who's never done anything, can't even come close to standing in the place that a true repentant can stand. So they're saying that if you have sinned, as we all do because we're human, and repented, you're even in a higher place than someone who's never had to repent.
Right. The holidays are not about being perfect. They're about being human. And being human is about doing wrong and learning from it, and then striving to be our best. And so this tzaddik, whoever it is, and notice, we don't even know his name. It doesn't matter, right? He's almost like a trope of somebody that could never really exist. He can't possibly get the human experience. He can't possibly speak to real people about the real work of the high holy days, because this is a time of year that's not about being perfect, but about being human and accepting ourselves for our flaws and striving always to be better. Amy, please, and then Beck.
Yeah. Strikes me as very linked to deceptive marketing and being hypocritical as opposed to being empathetic. He's happy to go on and on about everything. Like, yeah, right. Do you realize you're lying? You're making shit up, or perhaps listening to something others are saying, storing that your brain's back corner so you can talk for 15 minutes about something. Like it's something you've been through, even if, try me again, you haven't.
Yeah,
If you're genuinely empathetic to something, it's because, oh, wait a minute, you've been there too.
Right. Where's the empathy, right? Let's notice the irony, the paradox of this story. There is no such thing, first of all, as a person unacquainted with sin. Second of all, by standing up there admonishing him, he is doing wrong, therefore he is not unacquainted with sin, which means we're talking about a person who can't possibly really exist in the real world, which I think is some of the message of the story here, that the high holidays aren't about being unacquainted with sin. They're not about being perfect. They're about accepting ourselves for our flaws and learning from them, striving to be better, not thinking there's even such a thing as perfect. Beck, please.
we just talked about this, didn't we? It's not about, like, I mean, you and I in our meeting. It's not, the high holidays aren't about calling out other people's sin. It's not saying what other people have done wrong. It's about self-reflection. You don't get to comment on anyone else.
Right. I think that's exactly right. And I think, that's the hard thing about being the rabbi, that the rabbi has to actually speak to people on the high holidays. The rabbi's job is not only to look inward, but also to lead other people to look inward. So I think the Ba'al Shem Tov is also giving some sermon advice here, which is to say that you can speak to people on the holidays without admonishing. The role of the leader is not to admonish, but rather to help people accept themselves with their flaws, which can lead them to be better. It's pretty good homiletics advice, if you will. We're low on time here, and I have about 10 more stories, so I'm now trying to decide which one I want to do. I think we'll jump to the end here. I'm on, for those who have the book, page 315. We've moved out of the realm of the Ba'al Shem Tov and into other stories about other Rebbes. And we're talking here about the Rebbe of Lublin. I'm on this one that says sin and despondency. We'll finish with two stories. A Chassid complained to the Rabbi of Lublin that he was tormented with evil desire and had become despondent over it. The Rabbi said to him, "Guard yourself from despondency above all, for it is worse and more harmful than sin. When the evil urge, the Yetzer Hara, awakens desires in man, in humanity, he here is the evil urge, is not concerned with plunging him into sin, but with plunging him into despondency by way of his sinning." So it's an interesting thought here. Remember, we started off by talking about joy. The Ba'al Shem Tov wants us to walk through life with joy. Now, that doesn't mean that every moment is joyful, but some of the point here, I think, is that the enemy of the fulfilled life, to some extent, is despondency here, is the belief that you cannot be better, that you cannot make the world better, the belief that things are stuck just the way they are. Now, people fall into depression, right? This is a real fact of life. People go through these times of feeling sad, depressed, despondent. It's something that we know. And the Ba'al Shem Tov seems to be saying something along the lines of, it's not that you gotta be perfect. The point is finding ways to believe that you and the world you live in can be better. The High Holy Days are not about admonishing yourself for your imperfection, but rather about building your capacity to believe in your ability to be better and the ability of the world to be better. Not unlike what the Ba'al Shem Tov's grandson, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, said in a song I'm sure you probably all know, which is that all of the world is a very narrow bridge, and the most important part is what? Not to be afraid, right? The world is a very narrow bridge. The most important part could have been to stay on the bridge, right? Or it could have been that's to stay on the straight path, to do right and not do wrong. But no, Rabbi Nachman says we live in this world that is a narrow bridge. It's a scary place. It is, a place that has the potential to knock us off the bridge, to throw waves and wind at us. There's a lot of scary things that happen in the world. So what's the most important part? Not to be perfect, but lo lefached klal, not to be afraid, to walk through the world with the belief that you can make a difference, that the world ultimately has a kernel of good and so do you, and that you have the capacity to make the world a little better. Which brings me to one last story called True Justice. The words in the scriptures, this is 2 weeks ago's Torah portion, Tzedek, Tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue, were interpreted in the following way by the Rabbi of Lublin. When a person believes that they are wholly just and need not strive further, then justice does not recognize him. You must follow and follow justice and never stand still. In other words, why does it say tzedek, justice, justice you shall pursue? Because you got to keep following justice. It's not something you do once, it's something you do over and over again. Never stand still, he says. And in your own eyes, you must always be like a newborn child that has not achieved anything at all, for that is true justice. So what is the role of the high holidays? In some ways, this brings us back to full circle. We're all standing at the garden. We're all, all of the souls back in Adam's soul with this opportunity to burst out into the world. And what are we going to do with our next year? We're supposed to pursue justice. And what you did last year, does it matter? Well, I guess not, right? And maybe it's not that it doesn't matter at all. We always bring our past with us into the future. We always carry our baggage with us. But you, as you start this new year, you are a little bit like a newborn child who hasn't achieved anything. So forget about all your pride about the things that you achieved, and also forget about all the things you did wrong, because this is a new year and you have the opportunity to fix. You have the opportunity to repair. You have the opportunity to do tikkun. You pursued justice last year, great. And that doesn't mean you're done. In the new year, we have to pursue justice all the more so. We have to pursue making ourselves our best and making the world around us our best. It's the best that it can possibly be. So I'd love to go on and talk to you more for another few hours about all this, but we've reached the end of our time. I want to thank you for studying a few Hasidic stories with me, and I hope that you have a sweet and meaningful new year. And I wish everyone a Shana Tova. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Shana
Thank
Tova.
you too. Shana Tova, everyone.
Thank you.
Shana Tova.